Hi, this is Nancy with On Points Tutorials, Tips, and Tours. I am very happy to announce that the quilt is finished. The Learning to Quilt is behind me, the one that we have been working on now for 2 seasons. I got it all quilted, the binding is on, and all I have to teach you is how to put the label, the sleeve, and the binding on the quilt. So we're going to start with the label. I learned this technique from my friend Elizabeth. She taught this to me about 10 years ago, and I've been using this label technique since then. It's very secure and super simple. You're going to start with a square of light fabric. Really doesn't matter what color it is, but just light enough that you'll be able to see when you draw on it. When I'm talking about drawing on it, there's some marking tools you'll want to invest in, some really good permanent acid-free marking tools. Here's just a few of the brands. I've got a Yoshida, Le Pen, Sukaniko, Micron, Stadler, Faber-Castell. Those are going to be the black pens for doing the marking. You want to be able to put your name, your city and state, and the date that you finished the quilt. But how fancy you make your label, it's totally up to you. If you have an embroidery machine, now's the time to pull it out and embroider what you want on your label. If you have all those fancy stitches on your sewing machine, you can do this. This is the time to do that now. But my favorite way is to actually use some of the colored markers. So these are some of my favorite coloring markers that are permanent on fabric. This one is my absolute favorite from fabric. My absolute favorite from Faber-Castell. That is a tongue twister. Wonderful colors. These are called Pip pens, Indian ink, totally permanent, so easy to use. And then this is from Sukaniko. These are the Fabrico fabric marking pens. So the idea, I've got my square of fabric. I used a little bit of my Mary Ellen's Best Press to stiffen it up to make the drawing a little bit easier. And I'm going to fold it in half. Press it, and then I'm going to mark on it. So to make it a little easier to mark on, I use a really fine grade sandpaper. So I've got a sandpaper stuck to a board. That's going to make it stay still when I'm drawing on it. So now I can take my pen, write my name, my address, Grand Rapids, Michigan, the date that I finished the quilt. Or I could use my colored markers and get super fancy on it. Then I'm going to take the back of my quilt. So you might remember when we did the quilting on the quilt, I had you stitch first on the border, and then I had you do a straight line of stitching along the outside edge. That is going to help us with the placement of our label. So you can see here, I drew it with black markers so you can see it really clearly. That's the edge of my quilt. I'm going to take my label, and all the way around the edges, I'm going to use a few dots of my Roxanne's glue. There we go. I don't need too much. I just need it to hold on while I'm putting the binding on it. I told you in the beginning that this was fast and secure. It's secure because this label is going to set here in the corner. It's fast because the only hand stitching is on this diagonal, and it's secure because when I'm done, I will have my binding stitched all the way around the edge. So nobody's going to be able to easily take off the label. So hope you like that tip on making a fast and secure label. The hanging sleeve is what I put on the back of my quilts so that I can hang the quilt up either at home on a wall or if I'm going to enter a quilt in a show. Keep in mind, not every quilt needs to have a hanging sleeve. If it's a bed quilt and you know it's only going to ever lay on a bed, it doesn't need a hanging sleeve. But if you are going to put a quilt in a show, and if you plan on it hanging on a wall, you need to have a sleeve on the quilt. It'll just make it a lot easier to hang it up. So this is how I do my sleeve. I take a piece of fabric and I cut an 8-inch wide piece of fabric, and I have cut it the width of my quilt. So the width of my quilt goes from this dark line to this dark line. I don't know how long that is. I just cut it that wide. Then from the 2 ends, I'm going to fold it up with a 1-inch seam allowance on both ends. and then fold the sleeve in half. So now it's going to be 4 inches. Now, if you're making a really small quilt, you probably don't need to have a 4-inch wide sleeve, but most of the national shows now require a 4-inch sleeve for their hanging system. So I just put a 4-inch on it. I never know if I'm going to hang it or not. Then I'm going to place it along the top edge of the quilt. So it's going to place here, and I'll use my Roxanne's glue and actually glue that down so it will be secure. So when I'm putting my binding on, the binding will stitch down the top edge. Then all you have to do is hand stitch the bottom edge. Now, you could do it straight on the edge, but if you do that, when you put the pole in your quilt, you'll get this kind of a bubble at the top of the quilt, and I don't like that. I like my quilts to hang really flat on the wall. So when I hand stitch down my sleeve, I like to bring this fold and kind of fold it up so it's up about 1/4 of an inch, and then hand stitch this down. So then this will give it the pocket a little bit of an ease for the pole to go on the inside. So it'll hang really, really flat on the wall. This is how I hang my quilts. This is going to be a straight of grain binding. At some point in the future, I'll show you how to put a bias binding on. That's the binding that you need if you're doing a curved quilt, like a double wedding ring. So here's the little quilt I'm going to practice on. It's got a simple, basic straight line border, and I'm choosing my binding fabric to be a shade darker. I personally like my binding to be a little bit darker than the border of the quilt. I think it frames it in. But what you put on your binding is a total personal choice. To know how much you need, you want to measure the outside edge of the quilt. So all 4 sides of the quilt. Whatever that figures out to, divide it by 40. The width of the fabric is 44 inches. So if you divide the total outside edge of the quilt by 40, that will tell you how many strips you need for your binding. So for this quilt, I only need a couple, but I'm going to cut a couple of more so you can see how I piece them together. So just like always, we're going to cut the straight edge off of our fabric, turn that around, and I'm going to do some power cutting again. My binding strips, I like to cut 2 1/4 inches wide. That's my preference. It's not too wide, it's not too narrow. 2 1/4 inches is what I do. So if I'm going to power cut that, 2 1/4 plus 2 1/4 is 4 1/2, plus 2 1/4 is 1, 2, 6 3/4. So I'm going to cut 3 strips of fabric. I'm starting at 6 3/4. Cut, move it over, 2 1/4 to 4 1/2. Cut, move it over to 2 1/4. And I have my 3 strips of fabric cut. So now I'm going to piece these together. When I'm piecing these together, I like to sew it on the diagonal. I find if you sew the binding strips together straight, so right across the edge, making this one really long strip, when it comes time that the binding is on the quilt, because it's one long strip, they'll create a bubble, a really thick layer of fabric right on the edge. I don't like that. I like my bindings to be pieced on the diagonal. So to piece it on the diagonal, you're going to lay your strip down straight. Don't worry about cutting off the selvages. You'll end up doing that later on anyhow. And lay the next piece across it at a 45-degree angle. Then I'm going to use my white marking pen and a little ruler and draw across that diagonal. That's going to be my stitching line. Using a couple pins, keep that in place. Then go to the end of that strip and do the same thing. So here's the end of my strip. Right sides are up. Going to take the next strip, right sides down, draw that diagonal, and pin it. Now I got to fess up. I rarely draw the diagonal anymore. I've done so many of these. If I can't draw that straight, sew that straight line, I'm in big trouble. I also don't pin it anymore either. But this is going to get you to the comfortable stage so that you know that you're sewing it nice and straight. When I go to the machine next, I'm going to set my sewing machine up with the needle in the center position and the stitch length at 2.0 with a like colored thread. I'm going to put a very dark color thread in this to match it. Why? I'll explain that to you in a bit. So I'm at the machine now. I've got my needle in the center position. I've got a black thread in to match this fabric, and I've shortened my stitch length. I'm going to start sewing, so I will be sewing on that diagonal line, starting to sew right here in that little valley. When I get to the end of this valley, it's going to stop with the needle in the down position, so I can just take my next piece, bring it right up into place, and sew right onto the next piece. So sometimes if I'm doing a king size quilt, that's usually 8 to 9 strips of binding. So this can make it go a lot faster if you're going to chain piece these. After they're chain pieced, you're going to go to your cutting board and cut these apart. I found this really cool little tool at a show. This is going to cut my pieces apart. There's a little blade. So I've chain pieced, I lay it in there and it cuts it apart. Coolest little thing. All right, now I'm going to trim off the selvage. I told you don't worry if the selvage is there because we're going to end up cutting it off now. So I'm going to cut off the selvage and then cut that seam to about somewhere between 1/4 of an inch and 1/2 of an inch. Doesn't really matter exactly what size it is. Just cut them off about 1/4 to 1/2 inch. And now we're ready to press. The beginning of my strip, I'm going to take the beginning part and fold that down at a 45-degree angle and press it. Then I'm going to take my scissors and again cut it off at about 1/4 to about 1/2 of an inch. Now I'm going to press this entire strip in half, being real careful to not stretch the binding as I go, pressing it really crisp. I want to use lots of steam when I'm doing this. When you come to one of those seams that you sewed, those diagonal seams, you're going to press that open. Again, that's going to be one of the things that's going to help keep the bulkiness of that seam out of your binding. So press that seam open and press the entire strip in half. After this, we're going to sew it down onto the quilt. My binding is all pieced. Now I'm ready to put it on my quilt. So I'll take that end. This is the end that has the 45-degree fold on it. And I'm going to place it somewhere in the middle of the long edge and pin it into place. But you don't start sewing there. I pinned that in place just to hold on to it. I'm going to start sewing about 6 to 8 inches away. And just so I can get it to the machine, I'm going to put a pin in there. But typically, I don't put a pin in there. And I'm going to go to the machine now. At the machine, I've set it up with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. So my normal scant 1/4 inch seam allowance. In this case, this foot means that I've moved my needle over to the right. You might have to have a walking foot on your machine. This machine already has a built-in walking foot, but if you need a walking foot, you need to put that on now and then find the 1/4 inch seam from the right-hand edge of your foot. Throw the binding piece behind you, and we're ready to start stitching. So I'm starting about 8 inches from the end. And I'm going to sew a nice 1/4 of an inch. I do not put pins in along the edge. There's just no reason to. They're going to end up poking you, and the binding is going to move a little bit anyhow. So don't worry about putting pins in. When I get to the corner, I'm going to stop a bit more than 1/4 of an inch from the edge. So in this case, I would say 2 stitches before 1/4 of an inch from the edge. And I'm going to do a reverse stitch. Then stop and cut off my thread. You know what? This might be a good time for me to mention that you'll see that I have not trimmed my quilt. My quilt still has the extra batting and backing on it that it had while I was doing the quilting. I want that there. I will end up trimming it off later, but I do not trim it off the quilt before I put my binding on. So I've sewed to a big fat distance, big 1/4 inch distance from the end of the quilt, cut off my thread. Now I turn the quilt. This is the corner. When I do this corner, I fold it up. Now in the folding it up, this should make a 45-degree angle right to the corner of the quilt. This is a square right here, perfectly square, 45 degrees. And I bring this down, and when you bring it down, you need to bring it down just below the edge of that binding. If this fold is up above the binding, you will end up with a dog ear on your quilt. It will stick out funny. So you want to be sure that this folds down below the edge of the quilt. And then pin it in place, and then you're ready to start sewing. So when I start sewing here, I start off the edge. Whoops, I'm in reverse. There we go. And then sew onto the edge of it. Now I'm going to continue all the way around till my next corner. I'm coming up to my next corner. So just like with the other one, I'm going to stop before a 1/4 inch from the edge and reverse. Cut off the thread and turn the quilt. So here's another fold, another view of the fold. I'm going to take and fold this up, then bring it down to below the edge of the quilt, secure it in place with a pin, and start sewing off the edge again. Here's to my corner, and reverse before you get to the 1/4 inch. So as I come to the end that we had done the easy fold on, before I get to the end, I'm going to open up my strip and cut that off at a diagonal. Then I'm going to take that strip and tuck it right in to that folded strip. So I'll just sew over all the layers right now. Now when it comes time that I'm doing the hand stitching, I'll show you how I stitch that down, and it just really makes the simplest binding beginning and ending I know of. Now I want to show you how I trim my quilt. So I've left that extra batting on the quilt all the way through this, so I've got something to hold on to, but also, and more importantly to me, I want to be sure that my binding is full. One of the first times I entered a quilt in a show, the judge said, "Nice quilt, blah, 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 but your binding wasn't full." And I was like, what does that mean? My binding's not full. Took me quite a while to find somebody that knew how to explain that to me, and I have figured out how to make it so I will never again hear that comment from a judge. So when I am trimming this, I'm not trimming it right to the edge. I'm trimming it wide, about 1/8 of an inch wider than the quilt. So it's coming out all the way to here. I'm going to trim it all the way around. And when it comes to the corners, I'm going to trim the batting and the quilt top away at a diagonal. So right there. So that's going to eliminate a lot of the bulk in the binding. Then I'm going to use my new favorite tool. This is the Clover Wonder Clip. They come in lots of fun colors. I just love this little guy. And it even has another pin cushion. So just for those people that think one pin cushion isn't enough, now I have two. So this holds all of my Wonder Clips on it. Love the Wonder Clip. The shape of it, the strength of it, it's flat on one side, it's curved at the top. It holds the binding beautifully. When I bring the binding around to the back, you can see my line of stitching here. I want that binding to go all the way just past that line of stitching. With the distance that I cut the binding from the quilt, that means that there is a slight little fold of the quilt edge in the binding, which means I will never again hear that your binding wasn't full. As we come to the corner, when you're working on your corners, you want to fold the left side down first. And then the right side. And it's tricky. You've got to play with it a little bit to try to get that diagonal to be perfectly 45-degree angle there, and put another clip there. Next will be hand stitching. My binding is totally stitched down, and now it's time to hand sew the back of it. I know, there's people out there going, seriously, you do not expect me to hand stitch this all down. Yes, I do. A proper quilt is going to be hand stitched down. Having said that, will I, upon occasion, machine stitch it down? I will. For my nephew, who's going to throw the quilt in the backyard anyhow, yeah, I might do it then. But other than that, I'm always going to hand stitch it on the backside, and honestly, I love it. It's the time to just sit and relax with your quilt. You're looking at everything real close. If you missed anything, this is the time that you'll see it. So hand stitching. So for the tools for the hand stitching, we've got my favorite thimble. Really, really inexpensive. I think it's still under $2, still my favorite thimble. A cotton thread, the Clover desk needle threader, still my favorite way to thread a needle. I prefer a really short needle, so I'm going to use a size 10 between, which is going to be a very small needle, and the Thread Heaven, which is a thread conditioner. So we're going to start. Cut a length of thread. You don't want it too long. If it's too long, it's just going to get all knotted on you. And then thread it with the clover. So you're going to hold it down, push the button, and thread that needle. Now I'm going to make my knot. So this is a little slip knot on the end. That's going to make it so that my thread doesn't come off my needle. I don't have to worry about it coming unthreaded. I'm going to coat it with a little bit of this thread conditioner. It's kind of like a silicone conditioner. You could also use beeswax. Beeswax has been used to coat threads forever and ever and ever. I'm going to start sewing on the side of the quilt that had that little tucked edge so I can show you how I'm going to finish that off. So from the back side, I'm going to start. I did not put a knot on the end of the tail. I don't need a knot. I'm going to start away from the binding and bring the thread up. As I'm bringing the thread up, when the tail disappears, I stop. Now I'm going to grab just the edge of the binding, take another stitch, then feed the needle. Oops, my thread came undone. Okay, I'm going to try that again. The tail went through the quilt, so we're going to try that again. Going to start it from the edge, Pull it till the tail disappears. Now take another stitch. As that loop gets small, pass your needle through the loop. That will secure it to the quilt. Now I'm going to start stitching. When I'm stitching, my stitch length is going to be smaller than 1/4 of an inch. The tendency I have is if I am using a larger, longer needle, I'm going to take a longer stitch. So since I want to be sure that I've got small stitches, I hand applique and I hand stitch down my bindings with a small needle. Now this is not going to happen overnight. You're going to have to take your time and work your way around this quilt. So I've worked my way close enough to that little end where the end of the binding tucked inside the other. I want to show you what I do with this. So as I come to it, I'm going to make a knot. Now, I honestly make knots probably every 3 inches as I'm going around this quilt. When I was starting to sew skirts and I was hemming skirts, my mom told me that to be sure that you never ended with a hem coming down throughout the day, always make a knot in your hem every 5 inches. So if it came down, only 5 inches of the hem came down. I think that works for a binding too. So every 3-4 inches, I'll actually make another knot. So now is this part that I did the tucking. I'm going to just come up and it's like hand applique. I'm going to do the same stitch that I would do for hand applique, going all the way up this and all the way to the front side. That's going to secure it and keep it really, really flat. Now we're going to work our way around to a corner. So now I'm to the corner and I want to give you a little bit of detail on how I try to get the sharpest corner I can. I've stitched around to the edge and you'll see this where it's folded. I want that diagonal fold to point right into the corner of the quilt. I want to try to get this outside edge to be as crisp of a corner as I can. So as I stitch up to it, I'm going to stitch and grab the bottom piece of binding. Oops. There. And then I'm going to grab that 45-degree fold right there on the fold. And then do a knot right in the corner. And that's going to secure it. After I've done that, I am going to stitch all the way here. So I'm going to do little tiny applique stitches on the back side and on the front side to secure those down. I also want to show you the back of the quilt. This is where we have the sleeve and the label on the quilt. So on the sleeve, you can see the top section is stitched down where the binding was stitched down. All I need to do is fold that up a little bit, so about 1/4 of an inch, and then I'll hand stitch that down. Then my sleeve will be secure, and then my label over here on the other end, the same idea. 2 corners have been secured with the binding going down, and the last is just this little diagonal edge. When that is done, the quilt is done. That means I have finished my quilt. Before the binding is on, the quilt isn't finished, so now it is finished. That is 2 seasons worth of shows, showing you lessons, tutorials, and tips on making the Learning to Quilt quilt. I hope you really enjoyed it as